Hello everyone and welcome back to another Giant Slayer TFT Top 10 video. Today we'll be talking about the top 10 tips for patch 11.7. There's always the little things a player can do to improve, especially in games like TFT that's always evolving. Since Set 4 is ending soon, this will be the last top 10 tips we'll do for it, though several of the tips are generalized and aren't specific to Set 4. With all that said, let's go ahead and dive on in. But before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come, so be sure to also follow our Giant Slayer TFT social media pages. Alright, let's get back to the video. The number 10 tip we have for you today is to make sure you're upgrading your frontline. This may seem like a somewhat obvious tip because you're always trying to 2-star your units anyway, but it's a common issue where players simply ignore the frontline because they care more about their carry, a certain trait, or finding a chosen. Everyone has heard the saying, play your strongest board. What it means is having a well-rounded board, not just one champion that's upgraded. Whether it's early game or late, you need a solid frontline or your carry simply won't have enough time to do enough damage. For example, if you have a chosen Tristana during stage 2, but you keep losing rounds, despite her being one of the best one-cost early game units, the chances are you need a better frontline to buy her more time. There's a lot of options for frontline units, though the later the game goes, the more narrow those options become. But during the early and mid game, there's Vanguard, Brawler, Elderwood, and even Divine or champions like Annie. It is a good idea to tailor your frontline towards whichever carry or chosen that you're running, so using Annie as an example, she's great if you have Mage or Fortune. But overall, what matters most is having frontline units that don't immediately fall over and die to anything, so 2-starring them is still important. Let's move on to the number 9 tip for today. Play for an early advantage by using Fortune. First off, we have to say that Fortune is a risk. If you're inexperienced with loss streaks or playing with low health, then we definitely recommend staying away from Fortune. You can get by with never playing this trait if you're not comfortable with it. That said, one of the best ways to gain an early game advantage is to utilize Fortune. There's two main ways to do this, with the first one simply winning while having 3 Fortune active. Winning with Fortune provides you an extra 2 or 3 gold each round, plus the gold for winning and any extra you get dependent on your streak. This is a lot of extra gold income. Of course, winning with Fortune can be difficult, so don't plan on this always working out. But if you're strong enough to win every other round, you're getting quite the benefit. The other way to play Fortune is by playing for a loss streak. To do this, you want to play Fortune right away during stage 2, because the further you go into the game, the more damage you have to take, so having Fortune active early is important. It's not always possible to run early Fortune, but there is a way to manipulate it into your favor. Rolling. It may seem wrong, but rolling to find Fortune isn't all that uncommon. There is certainly an inherent risk to it, because spending gold on rolling is usually a bad idea, but if you're not hitting Fortune by 2-3 or 2-5, you can try to roll and hit the units. From there, play to lose until you get a decent loss streak going. After that, you want to roll the round before you want to get a payout to upgrade your board and slam items to be the strongest you can to hopefully win. Again, Fortune is a risk, but it can be a calculated risk worth pursuing to gain an early advantage during stages 2 and 3. The next couple of tips have to do with items. Up first, coming in at number 8, is to use the Mage Spatula on SWAIN, SHYVANA, and ELISE. The Mage Spatula item can be used on a lot of champions, whether for their damage or crowd control. But with SWAIN, SHYVANA, and ELISE, you're gaining an extremely useful benefit from the Mage trait, and that's more health. When those 3 champions transform and have the Mage trait, they gain additional health. This gives them a lot of extra health, making them the perfect champions to frontline for a Mage build. Conveniently, you can use each of them depending on the stage of the game. ELISE is easy to 2-star early on, so if you happen to hit an early spatula item, you can use it to turn her into a Mage. SHYVANA can then replace ELISE as soon as you can 2-star her, though she's not quite as reliable as a frontline depending where she jumps to. Finally, there's SWAIN, who is easily the best Mage Spatula user. The common Mage composition uses 7 Mage, which tends to lack in the frontline. SWAIN fixes that issue by having a huge health pool after transforming. Now, we're not saying to only use the Mage Spatula on these champions, but if you're running a Mage composition, those 3 are by far the best value. The other tip we have pertaining to items comes in at number 7, which is knowing when to make certain items. We've all heard about slamming items to get stronger, but that idea lacks a lot of context because you don't always want to use every component that you get. It's important to know which items are worth making and when. The easiest example we can bring up is in the early game. Certain items like, say, Hand of Justice or Sunfire Cape are valuable early game because they provide enough stats and are useful later on without being tied to specific champions. Hand of Justice is definitely the best for this since it's usable by so many different champions and scales well later on. On the other hand, you may not want to use an item like Rapid Fire Cannon right away because you may not end up with a champion that uses it well. Instead, wait until the mid-game to make sure that you're playing a champion like Kale or Sivir. Late game generally favors utility items like Shroud and Zephyr. Sure, they're fine to use before the late game, but their value is much higher later on. So what it all comes down to is learning the best time for items. The general rule of thumb is early game items should be universally useful items like Hand of Justice or Locket, mid-game items for specific champions, and late game goes towards utility items. Next up, we have 2 tips about playing too greedy. First is the number 6 tip, roll early to give yourself more time to transition. Specifically, what we're talking about for this tip is to roll on a PvE round instead of the round after. An example of this is level 8, which varies when players level to, but the most common is on 5-1 after Raptors. Instead of rolling on 5-1 and having only one round to transition your board, we suggest doing it on the PvE round instead. This used to be a taboo thing to do because it wastes a bit of gold, but sacrificing a small bit of your economy for a smooth transition is definitely worth it. You're more likely to have a better transition if you're not pressured as much by time. Even if you're comfortable enough to do it in one round, try out doing your normal roll down one round early and see how it feels. Chances are you'll make fewer mistakes with the increased time that you have to make decisions. The second tip, coming in at number 5 in regards to greedy play, is to not be greedy with your chosen. This tip has multiple facets to it because it has to do with both buying and selling a chosen champion. For buying, it's a common thing where players ignore the options presented to them because it's not what they're looking for. It's greedy to do this because even if that chosen isn't perfect, it's still an immediate upgrade. Of course, this does depend on the situation and at what point of the game you're at. Early game, for example, you may not want that Assassin Diana or Vanguard Garen, but if you keep skipping the chosen you're given each round, it's more likely that you're going to lose more health with an inferior board. Later on in the game, this issue is even more prevalent because players want that ultra-specific champion and ignore multiple chosens when rolling. Instead, buy the chosen. Maybe not the first one presented, but at least the second or third. This is where the other side of the tip comes into play, as you don't want to be greedy with your current chosen champion. It's okay to use a chosen for a few rounds and then sell it, especially at natural intervals like a PvE round. Being flexible with buying and selling your chosen is a great way to preserve your health. Bottom line, don't be greedy with buying or selling your chosen. Moving on, we've got 3 tips about scouting and positioning, starting with the number 4 tip, position for what you're playing against. Okay, what we're talking about here is to not always be static with the way you're positioning, even if the build you're running has a standard way to position. Scouting and checking out what the lobby is playing will give you a good idea of how you may need to position, especially when you're keeping track of who you've played against. An easy example is clumping up your board against assassins. In general, most compositions don't want to clump up because of AoE or crowd control, but if there's several players running assassin-focused compositions in your lobby, it's worth it to clump up against them. On the opposite side of that, if you're playing a board that wants to clump up, like, say, Keepers, it can be worth it to spread out a bit if there's quite a few players running heavy AoE builds. Basically, the idea is to be flexible around your positioning and not always default into the standard way a guide may have told you to position. The number 3 tip about scouting is to left click and hold the unit you're planning to move when scouting. This may be a bit complicated to describe, but the concept is simple. When you pick up a unit and hold it, you can move around using hotkeys to scout other players. A silhouette of the unit will come with you, or you can just pay attention to where your cursor is. Either way, the idea behind doing this is to eliminate the time it takes to scout, go back to your board, and move that unit. Instead of scouting, going back and clicking on that unit, all you need to do is move the unit where you want it to be and let go of left click. Overall, this only really comes into play towards the late game when you're unsure of what player you're going up against. And it really only matters for a specific unit, like say you want to keep your carry safe, or you have a unit with Shroud that you need to move in response to how another player is positioned. But it's a useful mechanic to keep in mind, especially since positioning in the late game is partially decided by who's faster. And the last scouting tip we have, coming in at number 2, is knowing how to manipulate specific units. In every set, there's been champions with specific mechanics, and in set 4, there's quite a few of them to keep track of. Being familiar with those champions helps a lot in being able to position them or against them. Aurelion Sol is a great example, as he always targets the unit furthest away. This means you can manipulate where Aurelion Sol shoots his blast. Against him, use bait like Target Dummy. When you're the one with Aurelion, make sure you're not the one being baited. Another example champion is Tryndamere. He'll spin towards the largest clump of champions, so you can bait that out by having fodder units clumped together so that Tryndamere doesn't go for your carry. Overall, there's quite a few champions in set 4 that you can manipulate this way. Knowing how to do this is an easy way to gain an advantage in late game fights. And now for our number 1 tip for today, spend your gold if you're about to lose. It's stage 6, you have 50 gold and 10 health, and you're 1 round away from the PvE where you can level to 9 and roll. Instead of rolling to get stronger, you hold your ground and oh no, you got slightly unlucky and lost the fight you should have won. And now you're out in 4th instead of maybe 3rd or 2nd. This is a common tale for TFT where players choose to be greedy with their gold on low health instead of spending it. But folks, the game is over when your health is gone, so holding onto your gold is never worth it. Instead, spend that gold and look for ways to upgrade your existing board instead of holding out hope on hitting level 9. Of course, there are times your level 9 is the only way that you can get stronger, but for the most part, you're rarely ever in that position. There's plenty of nuance to this rule, but you're almost always better off spending your gold instead of losing without spending it. That's going to be it for today's video, folks. There's always ways to improve in a game like TFT, and even seemingly minor tips can have a big impact, so we hope these tips will be useful in helping you climb higher on the ladder. Let us know in the comment section below if you have any extra tips to provide. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.